Hey everybody, KC here. So today, I am so thrilled that we have as a guest on Morning Newsbeat, Andrew Davis. Now you may not know the name Andrew Davis, but I think it's a pretty good bet that you've seen one of his movies, at least one of his movies, and a movie that I think is one of the best summer popcorn action grown-up movies ever made. It's called The Fugitive with Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. And Andrew Davis is out with a new novel. His first novel. It's called Disturbing the Bones, and it's co-written by Jeff Biggers. And I love this book. It is just, man, is it a page turner. It is fantastic. It just flies. And once you get into it, you can't put it down. I read it in almost in one sitting. It was terrific. Andrew Davis was kind enough to spend a little time with me to talk about the book, talk a little bit about The Fugitive, and I'm really excited. So I hope you'll go out and get the book, Disturbing the Bones, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andrew Davis. Andrew Davis, welcome to Morning Newsbeat. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin.
So I have to be honest. My first reaction when I heard about your book, your new novel, is why isn't Andrew Davis making great movies like The Fugitive, and why is he writing novels? So that's my first question. Why are you writing novels instead of making movies, or are you doing both?
Well, I would like to be making movies. The business has changed a lot. There's all these articles about why aren't they making movies like The Fugitive anymore? Which is an interesting concept. You've got basically comic books being made into movies left and right. Some of them make money and some of them lose a fortune.
Well,
So,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, it used to be that I was lucky to be in this sort of sweet spot of Hollywood in the 90s and the 80s and even into 2000s when everybody knew your movie was opening on Friday and they would see previews in the theater and there was advertisements in newspapers. And now you've got 10 million choices about what you want to do on the weekend, between the internet and between streaming and the fact that kids have other ways of entertaining themselves. So the idea of going to the movies on a Friday night is not a big deal anymore.
Yeah.
And so the marketing and the attention span of people has changed. And this is all the business, So in the old days, the people at Warner Brothers who supported me would say, we like this idea. You've got some great actors who want to be working with you. Go ahead and make the movie. And now you've got 10,000 analysts trying to figure out what the market is and what the cost should be and that kind of stuff. So the scrutiny towards how they spend their money is really great. And at the same time, these companies have been broken up. And they've been bought and sold and bought and sold. And the people who used to be filmmakers who were running the companies are now sort of being controlled by accountants and by lawyers.
So was it as almost as simple as if you wanted to be a storyteller, sort of in control of your own narrative, this was the best way to do it?
Absolutely. You don't have any, you're writing a novel. First of all, this started as a screenplay.
Well, I was going to ask you that because it's so cinematic. And I should hold up the book.
It's called Disturbing the Bones. I wrote it with a great writer named Jeff Biggers. And we started working on the screenplay. It was an idea I've had for many, many years. And I started working on the screenplay with Jeff. And I realized that I wanted to put all this backstory and this texture and this historical kind of context to it. So I said, let's write a novel. And then we'll take out the best of the novel and go back and revise the screenplay, which is where we are now.
Yeah. This read because it was so cinematic and it was so visual. But it also struck me as something that was probably would require almost streaming because there is so much. It's a dense novel in terms of there's a lot of stuff going on, and trying to imagine that happening in 2 hours is almost impossible.
Well, I think I did that in The Fugitive.
Well,
it's
pretty
dense, and there's a lot going on,
Yeah.
And I think I can turn this into a great 2.5 hour movie. But anyway, I find the streaming stuff's a little boring. It just it doesn't have the kind of energy and the pace that a movie. I think I'm a movie maker.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
I suppose I could work on a long form project, but keeping the rhythm and the tensions up, as you said, when you read this thing, the people calling it a page turner. So, that's my goal still.
It is propulsive. I mean, I love short chapters. I mean, and this has a couple of chapters that are like 1 page long, and it just keeps moving, and it's so great. Were there challenges for you as a storyteller moving from being primarily a visual, you work in pictures in all the senses of that word, to what is basically a textual narrative? Were you storyboarding this in your mind as you were going along? How did you approach it?
Well, I was basically doing what I would do in a screenplay. You have to describe where you are and what the context is. I mean, but we could be much more descriptive here. We didn't have the pictures to play with, so we had to describe what we were, and describe what the action is, and describe who the characters are. I mean, there's basically three broad elements to this story: an archaeological dig based upon a true dig that happened in southern Illinois, a dig that Northwestern University was responsible for, called Koster, where they found 26 layers going back 13,000 years. Then there was a movie I made called The Package, which they're showing Saturday night at the Chicago Film Festival, or Saturday morning, actually, with Tommy Lee Jones and Gene Hackman and Joanna Cassidy, about a group of generals, the Soviets and American generals, who do not want disarmament, and they're gonna kill Gorbachev to stop it. Okay, and it's stopped by Hackman. And then there's a third part, which is the dark history of Cairo, Illinois, at the southernmost tip of Illinois, where Dred Scott was imprisoned nearby, and Grant led the Union Army, where in the 70s, blacks boycotted downtown, and it turned into a very dangerous part of the country, where the Klan rose up and Nazis rose up, and John Lewis was there, and Julian Bond, and there was a lot of civil rights tension. So we took these three elements and put them together and wove them into the novel.
Well, and I thought it was the stuff about Cairo, Illinois was fascinating to me. I didn't really know much about that. I mean, when I first read it, I thought, I wonder if this was a fictional place. And then of course, I went to the internet, and I was astounded the degree to which it is a place with a real pro-slavery bent for a long time. It was a place where there were lynchings. And I found myself wondering, were there specific events that took place there that sort of ignited your imagination in terms of the story?
Where I'm in Chicago, you can hear
Right.
sirens, and there's somebody in the hallway checking the security system. I'm
Right.
in a friend's apartment. Well, I just felt that the idea of racism and militias and the dangerous world we're living in was something that I wanted to have as part of the story. And it turns out, believe it or not, there's a terrible accident that takes place in the story. There's a nuclear accident. It takes place in Siberia and Mongolia, and it happens a few months before an election. And the woman who's running for the presidency is a black woman from Chicago.
Well, I have to say, when you wrote this, Kamala Harris was not the nominee.
Absolutely not. I mean, the headlines are jumping off the pages right now. It's scary. I just hope there isn't a big nuclear accident. But anyway, so the idea of race and the danger of World War and the history of what happened in another part of the world and is happening in America now, these are part of the themes that just resonated with Jeff and I.
Yeah. Was there I love the Randall, your lead, you're basically who's basically the lead character in the novel, because it's so interesting, because he has, on the one hand, he has all these professional obligations and professional ethics, but he's also I'm not giving anything away. It happens very early in the novel. His mother was a civil rights activist and a journalist who had disappeared, and they find her bones. And that's sort of the thing that starts the whole thing rolling. Where did that come from?
Well, I mean, the idea of this tragic story of this 14-year-old kid whose mother disappears, who was a reporter for Ebony magazine. And then years later, this young archaeologist finds his mother's body, and he has to now go back down to southern Illinois and figure out what happened. It's sort of like in the heat of the night.
Yeah. Well, that's what it felt like. Absolutely. And
Yeah.
that town has that sort of feeling about it of, and it was interesting to read about Cairo, in the sense that it was a place that okay, it had all this racial stuff going on, but it was also had a ton of it had a lot of post-war prosperity, but has fallen on hard times. I mean, one of the interesting things, it's not in the book, I found it someplace else, is it was one of the stops of the city of New Orleans that is no longer, but the train service never doesn't serve there anymore. It is literally a town that has been passed by in a lot of ways.
Right. And this was going to be Chicago because of the confluence. They call it Cairo because Little Egypt, the two rivers that come together like they do in the Middle East. So this is going to be a big trading place and all that kind of stuff. And then they built the Illinois Canal that goes across to the Mississippi. They didn't need it. They wound up doing it in Chicago. So, it's a very tragic and interesting story about the history of Cairo.
Yeah. I was curious about, because you clearly have in the story. I mean, you have not just you have a fictional version of Kamala Harris, which again was remarkable considering when you wrote the book. You also have a fictional version of Donald Trump. Did you ever consider using, I mean, not Kamala Harris necessarily, but using real people as opposed to fictionalizing them? I'm just curious because so much of the book is rooted in reality, like Cairo. Did you ever consider that?
Well, Kamala, Kamala Harris was not thought about as being the president,
Right.
but I did think about Michelle Obama because she's from the south side of
Right.
Chicago.
Hmm.
Her father provided the water I drank as a kid. He worked for the city in the filtration plant off in the lake. And the fact that this kid who was 14 years old, the Randall character, the main character, is a cop in Chicago now, who lost his mother. He came back to Chicago, and this character who's based upon a Michelle Obama protected him as a kid. She protected him from the tough kids on the South Side. And now she's running for president. He's got to be in the detail to protect her. So there's this interesting symmetry
Yeah.
about the backstory and the history of these people.
It is fascinating. It's interesting you talk about how Michelle Obama's father provided the water that you drank as a
Her
child.
father.
Her father, or
Yeah.
right, because you have a character, people who understand, for lack of a better term, plumbing and water. There's a character in the book who plays a very important part, because he understands how I don't want to give too much away, but right, who understands how plumbing works, both how it works and how to gum it up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that was, there's a lot of water under the ground because, I mean, this is interesting. This archaeological dig is there because the floodwaters covered the garbage up and the ruins of all these different civilizations over 13,000 years. So they've got a timeline of how people lived. So water and flooding and all that stuff is a part of the history.
Yeah. It would seem as I got to the end, again, I don't want to give anything away, but it seems like it's ready for a sequel. I mean, you have a sequel in mind. Is that and uh that might have elements of The Fugitive in it, in fact, now that I think about it. Is that in the back of your mind?
Well, I mean, we wanted our main characters to be alive, that's for sure.
Right.
At least not the bad guy dies, but we wanted our main characters to be alive. And I guess we'll just see what happens with the book and whether somebody's interested in doing a sequel.
Yeah. Last question, if I can, and to go back to something you were talking about a little bit before, because you were talking about the movies, kind of movies you made, movies like The Fugitive, and there used to be that it was almost a tradition that in August, the movies like The Fugitive would come out, right? And they would be movies for grown-ups. They'd be entertaining. They'd be popcorn movies, but they'd be intelligent. They'd be well thought through. They'd be well made, and and half of them start Harrison Ford. Um, can that come back? I think there's a market for that, and maybe it's just because I'm a grown up. But do you think that is there still a market out there for that you think the movie community is missing?
Well, I think, it's interesting when I was working on The Fugitive, and James Newton Howard, this great composer, came to visit me in Chicago, and I showed him a few reels of what we had put together early on, and I realized, this could really resonate because I thought grandparents could take their grandchildren to see this. That there was an appeal because you cared so much about Harrison Ford and what happened to him, and you were interested in this pursuit by Tommy Lee Jones, and there was a moral to this issue of corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. So it seemed that it could resonate. So I think you can make a movie that can appeal to young and old, that has some substance and some excitement.
Yeah. It's interesting. I will say I'm always one of the things I've always used morning newsbeat for is I like to find business lessons from the movies. And in fact, I co-wrote a book about business lessons from the movies. And The Fugitive is a great example of that because when you only view your job narrowly, right, which is what Tommy Lee Jones does in the beginning of the movie, and he says, "I didn't kill my wife. I don't care." He's gonna make a mistake in the sense of the larger sense of justice. It's only when he moves beyond the parameters and considers the whole context and looks at the big picture is that when justice is done and his job is really done. And I think that's a great business lesson. It's a great life lesson too, but it's a great business lesson about not to be hemmed in by traditional ways of thinking.
Well, I think what happens is that, in that movie, he realizes this doctor is doing things that don't make sense. Why is he helping people who are in trouble while he's on the run? Right? Why is he trying to? He's actually pursuing the truth about who really killed his wife. So he couldn't be guilty if in fact he's performing these things. And Tom says, well, I don't care, but he winds up caring about this guy a lot.
Yeah. Anyway, listen, this is a fabulous book. I hope you sell a gazillion copies. I hope somebody picks up the movie rights so you get a chance to make that movie. I hope you write a sequel. It's called Disturbing the Bones. It's available everywhere. Good luck with it. And I really appreciate you spending time with me today.
Thank you, Kevin. Nice being with you.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.